Hi guys, today we're going to talk about the discovery of cells. We're going to take a look at the scientists involved in the development of the cell theory, and we are also going to take a look at the two main types of cells, which are prokaryotic and eukaryotic. So let's get started. This is a nice timeline illustrating the discovery of cells. We wouldn't have been able to actually know that cells even existed if it wasn't for the fact that Hans and Zacharias Janssen ended up producing the first compound light microscope. So if you take a look over here, we have in about 1590, we have the development of the first light microscope. Robert Hooke was the first person to observe cells. He was actually looking at dead cells under the microscope, dead plant cells under the microscope, and he was the person to give us the term the cell. A little bit later, we had Anton van Leeuwenhoek, and he designed his own microscope. There are many different forms of microscopes around, but he actually designed his own microscope and took a look at the first living cells. He observed tons of different things under the microscope, and he called those living things animalcules. Fortunately, that was changed. What he was looking at were protists and bacteria under his microscope, but again, he was the first person to observe living cells. It wasn't until much later on that we have our three scientists here, Matthias Schleiden, Theodor Schwann, and Rudolf Virchow. These three scientists were involved in the development of the cell theory. So their work led to the development of the cell theory right there. Okay, so Schleiden, he was a botanist and he was conducting work with plants. And in the course of his research, he concluded that all plants were made up of cells. Theodor Schwann was a zoologist and he was studying animals, and during the course of his work he also concluded that all animals were made up of cells. These two started talking to one another, and they led to the development of the third part of cell theory, which is Rudolf Virchow, and he did research and he came to the conclusion that living cells come from pre-existing cells. It was thought that maybe cells probably spontaneously popped into existence out of nowhere, but that in fact is not the case. They actually come from pre-existing cells. Next slide. So these are the three main points of cell theory. All living things are composed of one or more cells. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function in an organism, and cells only come from pre-existing cells. The first two parts of cell theory were arrived at by both Schleiden and Schwann. Virchow was the one who contributed the third part of cell theory. You do need to know the three different parts of cell theory on, let's say, a test or a quiz, so I would study those carefully. Moving on, let's look at the two different types of cells. There are prokaryotic cells and there are eukaryotic cells. Main difference between the two is that prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. That doesn't mean that they don't have DNA. They do in fact have DNA. They just don't have, their DNA is just not enclosed in a membrane. Prokaryotic cells also have no membrane-bound organelles. They do contain ribosomes. Ribosomes are not membrane-bound. They're actually constructed of RNA and pieces of protein. So prokaryotic cells do in fact have ribosomes. They're smaller in size than eukaryotic cells. They're anywhere from 1 to 10 micrometers in size. They're our oldest cells. They evolved about 3.5 billion years ago, and they are our bacteria. So whether or not we're talking about the kingdom Eubacteria or the kingdom Archaeobacteria, they are our bacterial cells. Eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus, so their DNA is contained within a membrane. They have many membrane-bound organelles. They're larger in size than prokaryotic cells, about 2 to 1,000 micrometers in size, And eukaryotic cells evolved from our prokaryotic cells about 1.5 billion years ago. And they're the cells found in all the other kingdoms, so protists, fungi, plant, and animals. Just a closer look at prokaryotic cells. Here we've got a diagram of a prokaryotic cell. We can see here that we've got our nucleus found in the cytoplasm of the cell. Prokaryotic cells have a circular chromosome, meaning that it kind of looks like a rubber band as opposed to strings of spaghetti that you usually find DNA in eukaryotic cells of. So prokaryotic cells have DNA floating in their cytoplasm. Again, they don't have a nucleus, so no membrane bound. Their DNA is not enclosed in a membrane, and they have that circular chromosome. Also, you can see the small dots in here. Those are the ribosomes freely floating in the cytoplasm of the cell. They have both a cell membrane and a cell wall. Their cell wall is different than that of plant cells. It's made up of a different structure than plant cells, but prokaryotic cells do have a cell wall as well. Let's take a look at eukaryotic cells. Again, eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus, and they do have our membrane-bound organelles, as we can see here, all labeled, all nice and pretty. They are the more complex cell type, and again, the eukaryotic cells are found in the rest of the kingdoms, so protists, fungi, plants, and animals. You will need to be able to differentiate between plant and animal cells. So let's take a look. Plant cells are rectangular in shapes, and animal cells are circular or irregular in shape. So in order to distinguish between the two, the first thing you need to ask yourself is, what shape am I looking at? Am I looking at something that's rectangular or square in shape? If you are most likely dealing with a plant cell. If you're looking at something that is circular or irregular in shape, or you really can't identify the shape at all, you're most likely dealing with a plant cell. All right, that concludes our review. To review for your quiz, I would focus on the scientists that contributed to the discovery of cells and led to the development of cell theory. So those would be Hooke, Van Leeuwenhoek, Schleiden, Schwann, and Virchow. You need to know the three parts of cell theory. You need to be able to distinguish between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, and also be able to distinguish between plant and animal cells. Good luck!